The fastest way to blow up account is asking someone on social media what to do next. Hey there, Tamir from Fibonacci-Traders.com here with the weekly market recap. Let's hit the charts. We have SPY on the weekly. We have this trend line. We have been talking about this trend line for the past several weeks, and we said once price will hit this trend line, we will get a downtrend reversal, and here we are closing the gap. If we go to the daily, we have closed the gap at the 381 area. Now we have a doji on the daily, but on the weekly, nothing bullish on the weekly. Always zoom out to get a better point of view of the price action. And now let's see if 377 is the next support. If it holds, failing to hold, we may go again and test this yellow trend line. This yellow trend line goes all the way back to the lows of July 2010 and September 11, then January of 16, December 18, June and October 2022, and now we might retest it again if and when 377 will break to the downside. Follow price and use levels and trend lines to manage the risk. Next up is QQQ on the weekly. Same, we have talked about this trend line, and here we are getting our reversal to the downside. Now on the daily, we have this gap here at the 268.50. Let's see if it can hold, or are we going to fill this gap. On the weekly, we can see nothing bullish. Bears are in full control, closing this gap here, and we might retest this trend line. And if we look back, this trend line goes all the way to the lows of March 09, then April 2020, October 22, and now we might retest it again. IWM, once again, the longer the time frame, the bigger the trend, the stronger the trend. And here we are, second week to the downside. Now we are at the 172 area, failing to hold, we might going to retest the 162 that was June's low and October lows. And if 172 will fail to hold, we will retest this 162 once again. Dow Jones, after a very nice run since October lows up until 2 weeks ago, we are now 2 weeks to the downside. And now let's see if 325 will hold. If 325 will fail to hold, we might see 315 and 308. If we go to the daily, we can clearly see 322 is next on the daily, failing to hold 315 and then 308. So keep your eyes on the Dow. It was the strongest of them all, and now starting to pull back. XLE, after several attempts to break up and above the 94 area, we have sliding to the downside, and now next area of support will be this uptrend line that holds the higher lows since August 2021 to the penny of September 21, December 21, also July 22, September 22, and now let's see if it will hold. If this trend line will fail to hold, we have this gap here to the downside that needs to get filled at the 73 area. SMH, one time after another, several weeks failing to break up above and close above the 230. So bulls at this point just gave up and we are going to the downside. 203 is the next level of support that we need to look at. If we zoom in to the daily, 203 will fail to hold, then 198, 197, we have this open gap here. If 203 will fail to hold, this gap here will get filled. Natural gas, on the weekly, we can see this red trend line is a strong resistance. The longer the time frame, the bigger the trend, the stronger the resistance. And now to the penny and going back to the downside. If we look back, zoom in on the daily, we can see 617 area needs to hold as support. Failing to do so, we have all these levels to the downside, maybe going to retest back again the 5 area. Crude oil on the weekly, we can see that we have this trend line that helps us to identify the higher lows since March 2021 to the penny November 21, and now during December retesting it again, failing to hold, and we can assume with high probability that on the weekly next support area will be the 60, because if we look left, this 60 was support and resistance for the crude oil, major support and resistance area during 2019 all the way to 2021. So failing to hold, 60 is next. Bitcoin on the weekly, clearly we can see that the 18,000 area was a very strong support since June up until November, breaking down and now trying to break up and above, and from support it's coming into resistance. Dollar index from the 114 all the way to the 104. Now with 2 consecutive dojis on the weekly of the 104, we can assume that some bounce will occur on the dollar index and maybe going back to the 108. Apple weekly just dragging all the market to the downside. This yellow trend line is a very tough resistance for the bulls, and we see that in the past 2 weeks bulls just gave up trying to break up and above and flash to the downside. 134 now is holding. If we look left, during 2022 it was a very important support level, and during 2021 it was a very strong resistance area, breaking down to the downside. 124 Apple on the weekly will be the next support. NVDA, once again, another great example of why trend lines are the true support and resistance area for price action. I will put a link just about now over here on the right corner for a video I made about trend lines and why trend lines are the true support and resistance for price action. We can see a doji of a trend line. 158 needs to hold, otherwise we are going back to the 134. Zoom in on the daily, we have this gap to the downside on the 142 area. So if this level will fail to hold, we will close this gap here and going back to the 134. We can see that we do have here short-term trend line that holds the short-term lower highs, breaking down and under 158, filling the gap and going back to 134. Tesla just continuing to the downside, 150, as we said few videos ago. Once it will break to the downside, the 200 area, it will go to the 150. I can put the video in the link below. so you can check it out. Now 138 is next on the weekly for Tesla, breaking down this trend line. This trend line held the lower lows, now breaking down and under. 138 will be next for Tesla. So if you're looking to go long on Tesla, in my opinion, wait for it. Microsoft on the weekly, another great example of why trend lines are the true support and resistance areas for price action. This trend line started over 1 year ago, November 2021. Every time price reaches this area, this trend line, the trend line rejecting price action, and now we need 241 to hold, otherwise 228 for Microsoft is the next support to the downside that we need to keep an eye on. On the daily, we can see that if 241 will break to the downside, we have this gap here at the 228, and we know more than 80% of all gaps will get filled throughout time. Netflix holding this uptrend channel since June of 2022, 100% bull run on Netflix. Pullback is healthy after this kind of run. Now we need Netflix to stay inside this trend and inside this uptrend channel, otherwise 252 is the next support for Netflix on the weekly. If we zoom in, we can see 252 was a very strong resistance throughout August and September. So if this trend line on the weekly will break to the downside together with the 283, we can assume with high probability 252 will be next, and we need to accept that trading is a game of probabilities, and with trend lines, Fibonacci levels, and in-depth understanding of candlestick analysis, aka price action, we can increase probabilities for our side. Shopify, if we zoom out on the weekly, we can see that this area of the 45, 43 area is a very strong resistance for price action for Shopify. Now going back, reversal to the downside. Also Shopify made a very nice bull run since the lows of October, almost 100%, 92, 93% to the upside. Healthy pullback. 35 needs to hold, otherwise 32, and we have all the levels to the downside to keep eyes on and manage the risk according. And we see on the daily 35, if 35 will break to the downside, we have this gap here at the 33, 32 area, and we know more than 80% of all gaps will get filled. TAN, the solar ETF, also if we zoom out on the weekly, always zoom out to get a better point of view of price action. And it doesn't matter if you are trading on the 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 1 hour, daily, always zoom in, zoom out to get better point of view for price action, because the bigger the time frame, the stronger the trend. So if you are swinging on the daily chart, zoom out to the weekly, and by the end of the month also zoom out to the monthly, because the bigger the time frame, the longer the time frame, the bigger the trend, the stronger the trend. And we see here TAN, TAN, on the weekly we have these lower highs since January 2021, almost 2 years of a downtrend, and it's a bigger time frame, it's a longer time frame, bigger trend, and we see that every time price reaches this trend line, it's getting rejected, and now 75 needs to hold. Looking left, it was support, resistance, and now it needs to hold as support again. Otherwise, we will see this trend line getting retested again. So I hope you find this video helpful. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great weekend. Please hit the like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.